Hello and welcome to section 6.3, Business Ethics, Lehman College, fall of 2023. This chapter is all about what employers owe employees. We've talked about wages. We've talked about creating an environment that is safe, happy, and healthy for employees. And now we're going to talk about labor unions. So why might we have a labor union? Well, power imbalance. Our book never comes right out and says that, but people who are in upper management or are executives or on the board of directors have a disproportionate amount of power to decide who gets compensated, what the environment is going to be like, and what the goals of the company are, what people's days, work days are going to be structured like. As a single individual worker, in any company, you do not have that much power to figure out how much you're going to get paid, what your work life is going to be like day to day, and how your contributions are valued. And before labor unions in the United States, I've mentioned in a previous section this week, conditions were atrocious. There were no compensation for people who were severely injured on the job or even killed, for their families, no compensation. There were no child labor laws. There was no weekend. There was no work week. Employers could set things however they wanted to. And labor unions in the United States at the beginning of the 1900s, late 1800s, worked really, really hard to implement these kinds of safety policies. But they also only experienced a brief moment of power. In the mid-century in 1900s, a lot of times federal and state laws were created to ensure that these worker protections were in place. And people saw less of a need to come together into unions. One downside of that is you lose your power of collective bargaining. Collective bargaining is when the mass of workers can come together and decide to strike to negotiate for improved wages, environment, and benefits. Our book also doesn't mention how there's been a lot of lobbying by the corporate world to dismantle labor rights. Technically, it's still federally illegal for any company to prevent workers from unionizing, but state by state and even some federal laws have chipped away at that over the years. And that's not to say that there aren't negative things about unions. There most certainly are. They can create exclusivity in the sense that a closed shop happens when everybody at a single employer is in the union. And if they decide that you're not a part of the union, then you don't get a job there. So if there's already issues with racism or sexism or inequality for any reason, it can be hard to fix that, remediate it. It's bureaucracy. It can make things a lot more slow and possibly less productive. And there's the fees. If you are required to join a union when you join a job, you are effectively getting paid less because you have to pay the dues to your union. But let's see. Union membership grew to a relatively high level in the 50s. It says 33%, which to me isn't all that high of a level. There are countries that have much higher levels of unionization. And it also tended to be a specific kind of work. It's not going to be the white-collar workers, of course, because they're already getting paid a lot more, and they are part of the management team, but more the manufacturers that dominated the American economy in the early to mid to late 1900s in the United States. But of course, starting maybe in the 70s, maybe a little bit earlier, we switched from an industrial economy to a service economy to an information economy. And those last two sectors are a lot less organized in the labor sense than manufacturing ever was. It's hard, at least it has been historically hard, to unionize service workers because people look at them sometimes as throwaway jobs. They have crazy hours that don't match up with one another. Different service jobs have different goals, but there has been headway in unionizing service workers in the last couple of decades. We still have dropped all the way down from 33% to, let's see what the percentage is, 6.5%. Only 6.5% of the workforce in the United States is unionized, and that gets concentrated in certain types of jobs, like teaching. I am in a union, and a high percentage of people who teach in CUNY are unionized. This chart is all about right to work laws. And you can see that it's clustered at least quite a bit along political lines, where the ones in gray without right to work laws tend to be more liberal, and the ones in blue with that do have right to work laws are more conservative. And it also reflects where unionization was the strongest. So unionization was the strongest in liberal states. In the more southern states, less so. And what is a right to work law? Well, it says you are allowed to get a job at a company, but you're not required to join the union. And this creates a workplace where some people will be unionized, some people won't. And that can create deep tension amongst employees. Here's a little graphic just to drive the point home. We had union members all the way up here, and this doesn't even go back to the 1950s, 1980s. Still it was 20%, and now we're here all the way down 11, 12%, which does contradict a little bit about how it said 6.5%, but we'll give that a pass. We do get another chart talking about how 8 industrialized nations compare with one another. In Australia, 25% of the workforce is unionized. Canada, 30%. Germany, 26%. Italy, 35%. Japan, 22%. Sweden, 82% of people are unionized. United Kingdom is almost 30%. And now this one says 12%. So we get a whole bunch of different numbers, but it's still pretty low. The only one less here is France, who only has 9% unionization. So we can see that in Europe, which is also part of the Western world, the intellectual and economic heritage that we have in the United States, it's a bit stronger than we have inherited here. But the thing is, when we compare that to charts about productivity, the United States is way up there. We have shot up in our productivity year after year after year, but still have less purchasing power and power to negotiate our salaries. And this leads to a divergence. So there's the productivity of United States workers going up and up and up and up and up, while compensation has flattened. You can see here, this is right where unions started to decline. And again, unions are not perfect. This is just how it happened. The pay ratio is the key statistic for many people. And what is the pay ratio? It's the difference between what the CEO of a company makes and what the average worker makes. And we hear this a lot. In the United States, it's insane. It's 300 times what the average worker makes. A lot of this can be in stock options, which people think, okay, well, maybe the regular everyday worker needs some stock options too. And to try and drive home just how much this has changed and how things can change for the better and the worse. It wasn't always this bad. In the United States, it was 20 to 1 in 1965. So that means the CEO made 20 times more than the average worker in their company. And just in 50, 60 years, that has gone from 20% to 300%. And it's different in different places. Again, in Europe, in the UK, the United Kingdom, it's 22 only. In France, it's 15. And in Germany, it's 12. So you might think that CEOs and inventors, they deserve compensation for their charisma, for their drive, for their creativity, for their intelligence. But you can still recognize that the gap between is unfair or unethical when it diverges so strongly from what the average worker is doing, just trying to get by. We're going to just skip this because I want to get to the last section. You can take a look at it on your own time if you want. It's an example of a workplace in which there were some people who had the right to work, some people who did not. So the union went on strike, and the people not in the union just went into work every day. And you can imagine how that might create tension, even after the contracts are settled. The last section of this chapter, What Employers Owe Employees, is about privacy in the workplace. So we all know that, especially if you go into work, there might be cameras that are watching you as you work. If you're working on a computer, your keystrokes might be logged. Some employers look into your email and scan it. There could be microphones and other, who knows what kind of electronic monitoring devices. And now, with a lot of people working from home, there's even fuzzier zone because you're probably using your own equipment at your own house. But sometimes there are still electronic surveillance monitoring in what you're doing. How long have you been idle? What are you looking at? What websites are you looking at? What have you been typing? And what have you been sending in your emails? And you can see how this feels unethical in many situations. You have your privacy. How much is it okay for your employer to monitor all of your activity and production for the entire day? Now, companies, of course, do need to protect their assets. They need to protect threats in the workplace. They have to make sure people are behaving ethically as employees. So there needs to be some kind of balance. But how do we figure out what's right and what's wrong in this arena? Again, they jump to the feature box before we even talk about the definitions, but we'll jump ahead and then we'll go back and we'll think about the definitions. The feature box here is right at the end of the chapter. It's called What Would You Do? And it's a hypothetical. You say you're a manager at a large high-end jewelry store. You have an international set of clients. And for the most part, your employees are very incredibly trustworthy. But over time, you start to notice some losses, some things going missing. You have 150 employees, so you don't know who's doing it, but you suspect that there is an operation in which people are taking stuff into the break room and hiding it on their person and then giving it to someone else to take out of the store. So what do? Your more close associates, including some of your employees, encourage you to put cameras in break rooms and even in the restrooms. Not in the stalls, but in the restrooms themselves. And this would obviously be a secret because you want to catch the people who are doing the thefts. What do you do here? That seems like it might be a direct violation of privacy, especially in the restrooms. You might catch these people, but what are you going to pay? What is the cost you are going to incur for environment sort of issues when everybody figures out that you have cameras around? Are people going to stop trusting you? Is there going to be more of a hostile environment? How else might you catch these thieves? So the feature box wants you to think, well, what issues are you going to have to think through when you decide what to do? And what would you do if you were the manager? That's the last slide, but I'm going to go back and talk a little bit more about the legal and ethical aspects of monitoring. The law has mostly sided with the companies if you are using company equipment. So any sort of laptops or phones or pagers that are assigned to you from a company are fair game. Whereas if you have your own personal email on your personal devices, the privacy protections have been on the side of the employees. And this has happened multiple times. There's a lot of legal precedent now that even if you're using the device that was issued to you by your employer on your own time, you're not being compensated, you're not on the clock, they can still go in and look through whatever you did on that device. So that is a good thing to know. And the very last thing that they talk about in this chapter is drug testing. Which is an interesting topic in which there are some laws that require some professions to be drug tested, like airline pilots and train engineers, trucking companies, rail lines, security-related firms. But in a lot of jobs, there's no law. There's nothing to say that people have to be required to take a drug test or not. So is this violating someone's privacy? Is this an ethical issue? Is it wrong to force your employees or your prospective employees to actually give up information about their medical and biological status just because you say so? Or should there be a reason? Like if your productivity has taken a nosedive or you are demonstrating signs of addiction. The law is mixed. Sometimes when it gets to be even more invasive, where some companies require somebody to actually be in the room when people are giving the sample, they have stricken down the employer's right to enforce these kinds of rules, but it's still very much an open question. So that's it. That's the end of chapter 6 in our business ethics textbook. As always, please email me if you have questions or comments. And I'll see you next week.